On April 18th, the CNN reported that President Clinton said Iran had been subject to quite a lot of abuse from various Western countries in the past and should be told it had a right to be angry. His conciliatory remarks revived a heated debate over ending 2 decades of hostilities with the United States. Reformists played up President Clinton's remarks, while hardliners strongly opposed to relations with the United States have rejected Clinton's remarks as a move to secure renewed political and economic influence on Iran. Today, we move that debate to Baltimore by having Professor Shaul Bakhash to deal with the complexity of this issue, both on the Iranian and American sides. Dr. Bakhash, a specialist on the politics and history of modern Iran, received his BA and MA in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University and his doctorate from Oxford University. Until 1978, he worked as a journalist in Iran. Subsequently, he taught at Princeton University before joining the faculty of George Mason University. He has authored The Reign of the Ayatollahs, Iran and the Islamic Revolution, and Iran, Monarchy, Bureaucracy, and Reform under the Qajars, 1848 to 1896. Among his recent articles have been a proposed framework for Iran-U.S. negotiations, an analysis of the politics that led to Khatami's election as Iran's president, and a profile of Khatami's writings and politics as president. He has been a fellow at the U.S. Institute for Peace, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He is a member of the board of Human Rights Watch, Middle East, and the editorial board of the Middle East Journal and the Journal of Democracy. It is an honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Bakhash to the Council.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shomali, and thank you all for being here. I'm sorry to be a little late, but the traffic out of Washington was much heavier than I anticipated. Nevertheless, I thought I had made it until your lovely Pratt Street, and it took me 15 minutes to... As Dr. Shomali indicated, Iran is very much in the news, and any development or statement of the United States referring to Iran attracts a great deal of attention in Tehran, both in the press and among the government. And I think that says something of the importance of the relationship or non-relationship for Iran with the United States. Now, a little over a year ago, in a by now famous interview with CNN, Iran's then newly elected president, Mohammad Khatami, called for a thoughtful dialogue, as he called it, between Iran and the U.S. In that interview, he spoke warmly of the founding principles of the American Republic. He said that there had been an estrangement between the two countries which should be repaired, perhaps initially through the exchange of scholars and academics and the like. Now, this move on President Khatami's part was part itself of a much larger, broader foreign policy initiative. A month before his CNN interview at the Islamic summit that was held in Tehran in December of 1997, Khatami made a pledge, a private pledge, to the PLO leader Yasser Arafat that Iran would support any position on Palestine and on the peace process that was acceptable to the Palestinian people. And that was a significant statement because Iran has been at the forefront of the critics and the very harsh critics of the Arab-Israeli peace process. In September last year, when he came to the United States for the UN General Assembly, Khatami's foreign minister gave an undertaking to the representatives of the European Union, saying Iran did not intend and would not assist in carrying out that controversial death sentence that Iran's former late leader, I should say, Ayatollah Khomeini had issued against the British writer Salman Rushdie. At the same time, since his election, the Iranian president has made a strong initiative to repair relations with the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, which he will visit for the first time in a few weeks. And he also made a very concerted effort to repair relations with the European states. In fact, President Khatami was an official visitor to Italy. Last month, I believe, he will visit Germany soon. This will be the first time that an Iranian president has visited a Western European country in an official capacity. And he was supposed to visit France as well after his Italian visit. But believe it or not, a controversy over wine prevented that visit from taking place. The French felt that protocol called for wine to be served at the dinner that the French president was to hold at the Élysée Palace. The Iranian president felt, as a good Muslim, he could not sit at a table where wine was served, and so over a bottle of, say, Chateauneuf de Pape, the visit did not take place. Now, the reasons on the Iranian side for this international initiative, this attempt to reintegrate Iran into the international community, I think are fairly obvious. Iran has been not isolated, as people think, in the United States, but certainly estranged on the international stage since the Islamic Revolution nearly 20 years ago. The Iranian economy has suffered. There is an attempt now to attract once again foreign investment, particularly in Iran's oil and gas industry and in other sectors as well. So that this was part of, if you want, these requirements and necessities. But at the same time, this new initiative towards the international community has a great deal to do with President Khatami himself, his election as Iran's surprise president in the middle of 1977, and also closely linked with his domestic agenda. Khatami was elected and was a sleeper. I mean, the favorite was a hardline cleric, but Khatami was elected on an election platform in which he emphasized the rule of law, the expansion of civil society, the protection of individual rights and freedoms, the freedom of association and speech and the like. He was particularly attentive to the needs of women and the younger generation in his election campaign. As I think you know, over 50% of the Iranian population is now under 16. And they voted, the young and women voted for him in large numbers. Since his election, he has made good against great odds on a great part of this agenda. The press in Iran today is freer. There's much greater freedom of association. Political parties have been formed, and women can walk the streets showing a bit of hair and some lipstick without being threatened with flogging. And I should also add that this initiative on the Iranian side was initially greeted with a great deal of enthusiasm on the U.S. side. There were positive statements coming from the President, Secretary of State Albright, in June of last year, in a speech to the Asia Society, spoke in favor of a roadmap that would lead to negotiations and the establishment of normal relations between the two countries. And there have been some small steps. For example, sports teams have been exchanged since the CNN interview. There's been a much greater exchange of scholars and the like, but really nothing of great substance has happened. I myself, just to give you an idea of the early enthusiasm and the expectation on the American side that something very dramatic would happen, was invited for a number of sessions with senior members of the State Department. Well, nothing much came of this, and I think it behooves us to look and examine why. First of all, as Dr. Shomali suggested in his account of what has happened since President Clinton's statement just a few days ago in Iran, there is strong opposition within the Iranian leadership to an opening, let alone negotiations and normal relations with the United States. And in fact, immediately after the President's CNN interview, his remarks were attacked, criticized, and denounced in the Iranian press. The President, as I said, had spoken very warmly of the founding principles of the American Republic. And for a while we had in the Iranian press, in editorials, a debate about what Plymouth Colony, for example, was like, and was it really as great a place as the President had suggested. And in fact, not only was the initiative towards the U.S. strongly attacked, but a couple of the President's other initiatives were denounced, blocked, or refuted. For example, even though the President had made the commitment I mentioned to Yasser Arafat of the PLO, the Y Plantation Accord between the Israelis and the Palestinians was once again denounced by senior Iranian clerics and other leaders, and the Rushdie sentence, which I think the government will adhere to, the statement made by the Iranians to the European community, was nevertheless reiterated. There are, as I say, within the ruling coalition, among powerful, if you want, lobbies in on the Iranian political scene, those strongly committed to what they regard as the legacy of the revolution, and who are strongly dedicated to the principles that they regard are important to the purity of the revolution. Such groups exist in the Revolutionary Guard, in the paramilitary Basij forces, in the revolutionary committees, and among some of the senior clergy. For these people, the question of relations with the U.S. or an opening to Europe is not a question which they would judge on the basis of whether is it good for Iran or bad for Iran, will it lead to more trade, will it improve the economy. For them, this is an ideological question. A principle of the revolution they believe was no relations with the U.S., and they feel, therefore, that this would violate it. It's like violating, in the Chinese case, Mao's Little Red Book. Secondly, what we face in Iran is a highly factionalized senior leadership of government officials and senior clerics. And within these factions, there are clearly interest groups who feel that their personal interests would be badly damaged by a foreign policy on Iran's part, which would include relations with the U.S. and much more normal traffic with the West. Representatives of this group speak not only out of conviction, but also out of calculation. I mean, they know, or at least they believe, that an improvement of Iran's relations with the United States would make a major difference in Iran. It would bring other groups to the fore and give them political weight and importance. Here we're talking then about the chance for elected office, for senior jobs in the bureaucracy and the government, patronage, and economic interests as well. Many of the senior clerics are involved or are believed to be involved or to be sleeping partners in important industrial and business enterprises, and they feel this whole kind of house would collapse if Iran's foreign relations changed dramatically as a result of Khatami's initiatives. In addition, and this is, I think, very important, there is the question of the supreme leader himself. As I believe you know, in Iran, the president is not the ultimate holder of power. Ultimate power is held by a very senior cleric who goes by the designation of the supreme leader or the spiritual leader. And he controls the armed forces, the security forces, he names the head of the judiciary, he selects the head of national radio and television broadcasting. I could go on, but it is there where real power lies. And while the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, no doubt acquiesced in the president's CNN interview and allowed this exploratory initiative with the U.S. to go ahead, he has strong reservations about it for a number of reasons. The supreme leader is personally in a weak position vis-à-vis the clerical hierarchy, and this matters in Iran. Unlike the leader of the Islamic Revolution and his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah Khamenei, very similar names, does not have the prestige, the scholarly standing, the weight in the community of senior clerics that his predecessor had. He fears that his position will be under attack. He relies for support on some of the most hardline elements within the politically important groups in Iran, such as the Revolutionary Guards and the Revolutionary Committees and courts and the senior clerics. So he doesn't want to do anything, as it were, to shake his support among the most hardline groups. Secondly, I think the supreme leader fears that he will go down this road of negotiations with the U.S. and be left holding an empty bag. In other words, he is still uncertain that Iran will extract from negotiations with the U.S. Concessions that will make it appear that this initiative was worthwhile. I mean, this is not uncommon, is it, with a weaker party? We've seen, for example, in earlier periods, the Arab states refusing to sit at the same table with the Israelis for a number of reasons, but part of it was because they feared they were the weaker party, and I think here there is a similar concern. And third, the supreme leader believes that Iran has gained enormous international prestige as a result of its Islamic revolution, its championing of Islamic causes, its willingness to stand up to the U.S. and to other great powers, and sitting at the table with the U.S., he has concluded, would be read as surrender, as a turning back on this revolutionary militant reputation Iran has established. And without winning over the supreme leader to the idea of negotiations and relations with the U.S., I'm afraid the initiative on the Iranian side cannot succeed. Now, the president is not without leverage. He has popular support. It is evident that a large proportion of the politically relevant part of Iranian society would like to see an improvement of relations with the U.S. The president has shown in his 2 years in office that he's able also to play the political game and to bring pressure on the conservatives. But nevertheless, in the end, the agreement of the supreme leader will have to be won over. There are also obstacles on the American side. Now, the U.S., as I say, after initial hesitation, responded with enthusiasm to what they thought was an opening towards Iran. And the pronouncements by U.S. officials about President Khatami himself and his reform policies have been very positive. In addition, it would be hard to argue that the administration doesn't appreciate the importance of Iran. It is the largest state in the Persian Gulf. It itself holds considerable oil and gas resources. It could be important in transporting oil and gas from the Caspian states, the former states of the Soviet Union in Central Asia and the Caucasus to Europe. It could be a market for goods other than oil and gas investments for the United States. I think you know that there is now on the table, waiting for an administration decision, an Iranian offer to buy several $100 million, I believe, of American grain. And observers have noted that there are many areas on which Iran and the U.S. could cooperate. Iraq would be one of them. And a strong Iran with decent relations with the U.S. could be a good counterweight to Iraq. In Afghanistan, Iran and the U.S. have probably much to talk about. A more temperate position by Iran on the Arab-Israeli peace process could obviously help that process along. On the other hand, the U.S. has been troubled and has raised as objections to Iranian behavior 3 or 4 specific issues. First, Iran's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. And there is evidence, I must confess I'm not one of those who's terribly persuaded by it, of Iranian programs to acquire nuclear weapons and to develop chemical and biological weapons. When I say I'm not persuaded, it's not that these programs are not taking place, I'm sure they are, but how far advanced they are, how committed Iran is to them, how certain Iran's success is, remains, I think, a question. Secondly, of course, for the U.S., there has been the problem of Iranian opposition to the Arab-Israeli peace process. And this is not only a verbal opposition. Iran supports in Lebanon the group Hezbollah, which is the group responsible for carrying out raids and military action against Israeli troops or the Israeli position in southern Lebanon. Now, the Iranian relationship with Hezbollah, whose members, like the Iranians, are of the Shiite faith of Islam, are very complex, and that's not the only reason Iran supports Hezbollah, but it's one of the reasons that creates friction between Iran and the U.S. and Iran and Israel. Third, the United States or American officials say they have not seen any change in Iranian support for groups that engage in terrorism or violence to achieve their ends. And finally, there is, the general hostility in the language of senior Iranian clerics against the United States. Another problem in pushing this process of a dialogue between Iran and the U.S. is that the U.S. has insisted on direct negotiations, and the Iranians are very reluctant to engage in them. I think the Iranians have been reluctant not because the U.S. has, as it were, set an agenda before the talks take place, but for the reason I mentioned earlier. It's a weaker party sitting at the table with a much stronger party. Secondly, Iran, I think, believes that its kind of armaments policy, its weapons program, its foreign policy are none of the U.S.'s business. In other words, they don't want to discuss the issues the U.S. Wants to discuss. And third, as I say, I think the Iranians are not clear what there is at the end of this road for them. Another, I think, issue for the Iranians is that it appears, if one looks carefully at the statements made by Iranian officials, I think there is reason to believe that the supreme leader has made it a condition of proceeding with this dialogue that the U.S. make a major concession, a gesture towards Iran. And so far, there has not been any such major gesture. American sanctions against Iran remain in place, and although, as it were, the anti-Iranian rhetoric on the American side is much diminished today, we don't hear American officials speak of Iran as a rogue state. Iran remains on the list of countries that supports terrorism. The U.S. continues to try to dissuade its European partners from investing in Iran. The U.S. continues to try to dissuade the Japanese, for example, from extending loans for a hydroelectric power generation project and so forth, so that one could go down the list. But seen from Tehran, yes, there has been a change on Washington's part in terms of tone and rhetoric and maybe some minor gestures, but not the kind of grand gesture that the Iranians hope for and expect. I think also the Iranians, in their overall foreign policy, have continued to believe that they can build a viable foreign policy in terms of trade and allies and the like without the U.S. And we can talk about this a bit more in the question period, but I think that has been a disincentive on the Iranian side as well. Looking ahead, what then lies in the future? I would say certainly an important series of initial steps have been taken. Secondly, there are, as I have already mentioned, grounds for cooperation in the economic and diplomatic field between the two countries. Third, Secretary Albright did speak of the desirability of a roadmap that would lead to normalization of relations. Unfortunately, that roadmap speech, which was very carefully, I think, thought out and articulated, was not specific enough from the Iranian point of view, and I think the U.S. failed through third-party channels to alert the Iranians to the nuances in that speech. So the speech, as it were, did not resound very much in Tehran, but it's there on the table, and I think is an expression of the American desire to go ahead. And finally, I think there is still the possibility of testing, at least, my theory that what the Supreme Leader wants is a gesture from the U.S. that he can sell, as it were, to his own constituents. And this would require the U.S. To overcome this hesitation, this reluctance to concede to Iran on one of the major issues that for the Iranians are important. Given the fact that we're nearing the end of this administration, or at least entering the election period very soon, given the fact, and I haven't talked about this a great deal, that in Iran itself, the new president and his opponents are locked in a bitter struggle, both over domestic and foreign policy. The answer to the question then are normalization of relations between Iran and the U.S. In the cards? Are they in the offing? I think the answer is yes, maybe in the future, but not right away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bakhash, for such a thorough analysis of the forces affecting the development of the Iranian-American relationship. Dr. Bakhash will answer questions, and I will repeat the question. The question is, what is the opinion of the people after relaxation in Iran, and your opinion as well?
I think, speaking about a rivalry between democracy and theocracy is not a bad way of putting it, but as always with Iran, the situation is full of ironies, because the new president, Khatami, is himself a cleric and emerges from the clerical class. But I think this, in a way, makes his policies and the position he has taken all the more significant, because what really we're seeing, as with, say, the case of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, is dissent emerging from within the ranks of the ruling hierarchy. And there are, in addition to the president, many other senior clerics who have been speaking for and writing about the need to open up political society. Now, the people voted for President Khatami in very large numbers. This election in 1997 brought about one of the highest turnouts ever since the earliest years of the revolution. And Khatami received over 70% of the vote. And people, and I can tell you from, in a way, personal experience, from my own friends, I have friends who have never voted before, neither under the Shah nor under the Islamic Republic, but who went to the polls this time because of the galvanizing effect that Khatami had on them in his election campaign. So the answer really is people were very excited by this message of the rule of law and the protection of the rights of individuals. And I think they remain very supportive of the president, but there are two problems. One is, of course, in a way they want to see him take continuously a strong stand and to defend these principles on which he was elected. So when he does, and I can give examples of this time, this enthusiasm is reignited. And when he doesn't, of course, it's disappointing. A more serious problem is the economy. The Iranian economy is beset by many, many problems because of the revolution and state control of most of the economy, but also because of the recent drop in oil prices. And I think ordinary people and the middle classes are finding economic life very difficult. And they had hoped that Khatami would improve job prospects and the economic situation and so forth, and that dramatic change hasn't come about, in part because of these internal obstacles, in part because of the very severe drop in oil prices. And I must confess, it concerns me. I mean, that if the economic situation remains indifferent, that the support for the president would erode.
Could you explain why the State Department criticized the French and the Canadian governments for supplying oil equipment to Iran?
Or should I do what you said Richard Haas would do, is to explain and criticize? Well, I think there is in place now the so-called ILSA, the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which requires the U.S., or at least obligates the president to consider imposing sanctions on third countries that invest in Iran's oil and gas industry above a certain amount. Secondly, and I did not mention this in my earlier remarks, I think there is one group in the American policymaking community that believes that pressure must continue to be maintained on Iran in order to make it change its policies in these areas I have described: weapons of mass destruction, the Arab-Israeli peace process, support for groups that use violence. And so, this critique of the French and the Italians, I think you mentioned, comes in part from the legislation that's on the books, comes in part from a desire to staunch what will be a flood of, they fear will be a flood of investment in Iran before the U.S. can secure its other objectives. You know, I think both in the administration and even in Congress, there is now some reconsideration about the wisdom of this policy, and we can see it being, as it were, eroded on the edges, but again, not fully yet.
How would you construct a roadmap in developing a roadmap if you were asked by the U.S. administration?
Well, I think when one talks about a roadmap, one thinks in terms of a series of steps, perhaps small in the beginning, which would lead to then sitting down and talking about the issues of substance. Certainly, I myself in the initial stages was much more hopeful that a series of small steps could be taken on which confidence could be built and then the larger issues tackled. And I think this is what the Iranian president had in mind when he spoke about a thoughtful dialogue between the two countries beginning at the level of scholars and academics and the like. And to be honest, I'm frankly puzzled by the inability of the two sides to agree on a series of small steps that would test, as it were, the goodwill of one side or the other. So, my answer would be, I don't think it's difficult to construct a series of initially small steps and then more significant ones, which one side would take in reciprocity with the other side. I think there's a great deal of suspicion on both sides. After all, at least 2 American presidents, if not more, were burnt in trying to deal with Iran. On the Iranian side, I've already mentioned the obstacles. So each side, as it were, is waiting for the other to take the major step first. And the process really has been, unfortunately, stalled for that reason. But I would move from small confidence-building steps to larger ones. And I think, the U.S. has been reluctant to use intermediaries, including its European allies, but I would. I mean, I would use intermediary countries such as the British or the French or the Japanese much more intensely than has been the case.
Do you think that the younger generation has a different overview of the Western civilization or culture than 20 years ago?
Yes, yes, absolutely. The answer to that is absolutely yes. One of the interesting developments in the last year or so has been 2 of the hostage takers of the Iranian students then, 20 years ago, who were responsible for the taking of hostages at the American embassy in Tehran, participated in dialogue with former American hostages or have become advocates of establishing relations with the U.S. I think, these are superficial signs, but every indication is the younger generation is very eager for kind of more Western culture. I mean, everything among the young, from the clothes they wear or the music they listen to or the pirate videos they want to watch would suggest that. And on a more serious level, there is a very important debate that takes place in the Iranian press and journals on this issue, and those who are spokesmen for the younger generation are supportive of a dialogue. There is a nationwide Islamic students organization who used to be very radical and very anti-U.S., and now its leader is very supportive of the idea of a dialogue with the United States. Sure.
Could you tell us something
yes.
about Khatami's background?
Well, he comes himself from a fairly prominent clerical family and married into another important clerical family. He got the traditional clerical training at the seminaries in Qom, in Iran. But interestingly enough, while he was studying to be a cleric, he also took the trouble to secure a doctorate in philosophy from one of Iran's non-religious universities. And he's written two very interesting books. One is a book on Islamic reformers, and it's obviously a book that lauds this effort to interpret Islam in ways that are in keeping, in his view, with the needs of the modern world. An even more interesting book he has written was based on a series of lectures that he delivered to university students in a period when he was in the political wilderness. And this is basically a book on, and in fact called, it's a book as an overview of Western political philosophy. And in this book, Khatami covers everyone from Aristotle through Locke. And he writes in the introduction that, while Islam was very rich in many areas of culture and human learning, theology, philosophy, the sciences, it was weak in political philosophy. And this is a very warm account of the ideas of political philosophers like Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu. So I think here is a man who really saw and was very attracted by the ideas of the political philosophers who, after all, formed the foundation of Western political institutions.
The question is, if Iran has the opportunity, do you believe they will seek the bomb?
I think, as with most things in Iran, there are two sides to the story. Yes, there are, I think, elements, particularly within the Revolutionary Guard and maybe in the military, who would like to arm Iran with nuclear weapons. I think, before the knowledge that both India and Pakistan now have a nuclear capacity, this was kind of less of a pressing thing for the Iranians, but it may have become more so. On the other hand, I don't think the Iranian nuclear weapons program is as advanced as was once thought, or is it being pursued on the scale that was once suggested by the CIA and other sources. And I really believe that the Iranians would welcome discussions and negotiations for arms control on a regional basis. In other words, if they, I don't think they want nuclear weapons for offensive purposes. If they were persuaded that their own security were protected in some fashion, it would not be as urgent a question for them as it appears to be now.
What is the role of the mullahs in Iran?
Well, from the point of view of Iranians, 20 years is already a very long time. Well, certainly the clerics are very firmly entrenched in the government. And again, without taking up too much time, I can tell you all the senior positions in the state are held by clerics. There has been, more evidence of technocrats in the technocratic jobs in the government, but still it's the clergy who control the critical positions. And there's certainly no sign of their willingness to step aside and adopt once again a more traditional role as religious leaders and advisors and the like. But there is a debate, within the clerical community about the wisdom of this continuing involvement of the clergy in politics. They don't yet have, as it were, the dominating voice in the debates. So, while we're seeing kind of more open discussion about the wisdom of continuing clerical involvement in government, I certainly don't see any indication yet of a strong move away from that. So, we're still some time off, I think.
The question is about the rise of the Sasanian, is it?
No, the Sasanian.
Sasanian Empire and the fall, why it happened.
Yes, when the Islamic invasion of Iran, of the Iranian Empire, took place in the 7th century, the Sasanian Empire collapsed with amazing rapidity. This great and very powerful empire, and it is, of course, as with the fall of all empires, a very interesting question. I think, the general belief is that Iran and the Byzantine Empire, too, had been exhausted by their wars with one another. The imperial court and ruling class had become very corrupt, too wealthy. The empire had become too large. I mean, I'm afraid I don't have any kind of dramatic explanations, but you know, and here was this extraordinarily energetic rising power from Arabia with the Islamic movement. And it's not only, you know, with the collapse of the Iranian Empire that the expansion of Islam is astonishing. It was true everywhere else.
The question is, after the abuse of the American embassy, why do you expect the United States to make the first gesture? Isn't it the other way around?
Well, you know, I think that what we're seeing in Iran right now is a process of change in Iran itself. And the question, I think, for the U.S. government is whether this is a trend that it wishes to encourage or not. Now, you know, one could argue as to the best means of encouraging it and whether this, you know, can be done through positive gestures or concessions or increasing pressure. But, you know, the U.S. has had terrible relations with many countries. But, you know, there always comes a time for healing, and I think, you know, we're at that stage now. I don't want to kind of belittle what you say, and I really am serious about that. But also the Iranians feel they have many grievances against the Americans, historical grievances. And again, to use the example of the Arab-Israeli negotiations, if you keep talking about the past, you really can never move forward, or in the case of Iran, the U.S. and Vietnam. So I would say yes, we're at a moment when maybe one can forget the past and start building towards the future.
Could you explain the Iraq-Iran relationship and its impact on the United States?
I would say, in brief, you know, Iran and Iraq, the relations are still quite strained. And although you hear once in a while, you know, rumors about the possibility of an Iran-Iraq alliance against the U.S., I assure you it's not going to happen. I mean, the bitterness and the ill feelings on the Iranian side are very strong, and the Iranians certainly don't trust the Iraqis or Saddam Hussein. What this means for Iran-U.S. relations is that, you know, if one could deal with some other problems, then there could be an opportunity for cooperation or a policy by the two countries to deal with Iraq where they have common interests. But there certainly is very little happening, you know, between Iran and Iraq itself that is of any significance. There isn't even today, you know, 10 years after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, there is no peace treaty between the two countries.
What is the future of the Islamic movement in several Middle Eastern countries?
And I should add that Iran, in a way, was the first. So if so much has come afterwards, Iran certainly provided an example and maybe even an inspiration. Well, if it's any comfort, I would say there is now an Islamic movement in Afghanistan with the Taliban that even the Iranians denounce as being too extreme. Well, I mean, it's very hard to answer, you know, kind of what is the future of this movement, because clearly it's a very broad movement and has taken hold in many countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Islamic world. I mean, clearly religion has become a vehicle for the articulation of political grievances and aspirations. As I think, you know, it's almost commonplace to say the Islamic movement is not monolithic, and there are differences between Islamic countries and within Islamic countries. But, you know, one is also beginning to see, along with the radicalism and the fundamentalism and so forth, much more positive signs. And again, one must kind of hope for the best and build, you know, on the more moderate movements and ideologies within this much broader Islamic movement.
Do you see any resentment between the religious movements and the economic or the small class?
Well, I think the Iranian case is different than the Turkish case for this, if for no other reason, the simple reason that the that the clergy are in power in Iran. And they have been for 20 years. It's also interesting that this kind of movement for reform from within the ruling elite emerged at a moment not of economic prosperity, but of economic difficulty. If also you talk, Iran has a very large middle class. It had a large middle class before the revolution. And in an ironic way, the middle class has expanded since the revolution. It may be that the country as a whole is not as wealthy as it was, but the number, if we define middle class in terms of education, living style, rather than just income or aspirations, then I think the middle class is much larger. And it's really this large middle class that is pushing for opening up of the political system, relations with the West, a move away from strict Islamic principles and standards in trying to control social life and the like. And the examples of that are legion. They're all over the place. Sure, if the economic situation remains difficult, this could increase some kind of extremist movements. But, Iran, again, I would say, when I spoke of economic difficulties, Iran is not a poor country. I mean, it's not Bangladesh or Pakistan or, it's wealthy by Middle East standards even today. So we're not at that point where people are so frustrated by economic conditions that they're going to turn to radical movements.
Well, I have to apologize for the rest of you who have questions, but I'm sure, like me, you have seen that the response to the questions was as thorough as the speech itself, and for that we are thankful to Dr. Bakhash.